Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to our meeting this evening. Concerned Citizens for Good Government. We have our distinguished guest, JeanPaulCoussan. He's a candidate for District 45 State Representative. That election will be, is it October 24th?
Yes, sir.
So 2 months away, something like that?
70 days.
All right. Okay. We're going to get to your program in just a little bit. Your other two opponents have already been to our organization, so we appreciate you coming also. Just a little house cleaning. Our next meeting would usually be scheduled for Monday, but it's Labor Day this year, so we will not be meeting on Labor Day. But our next meeting will be September 21st. That's the Monday, the third Monday of September, and we'll have candidates for City Parish Council. In fact, all three candidates that have indicated they're running, Carol Ross, Liz Webb-Abear, and Gerald Giudice will all be here. So we'll have an opportunity to ask them questions, as we will you, after you do your presentation, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Al. Good evening, members and guests. We're very happy to have Mr. Coussan with us this evening. As most of you already know, that he's running for District 45, House District 45. I have a little biography on him here. JeanPaulCoussan is a civic business leader in Lafayette, focused on family, community, and fostering an environment where local business, industry, and culture can thrive. A lifelong Republican, he seeks to elevate the community to the next level that runs the State House District 45. JeanPaul is a small businessman and partner of the Lafayette real estate law firm of Andrews Boudreaux, complete title, and co-founder of Cougar Construction LLC, a real estate and investment company with a focus on residential construction, project, and retail units in Lafayette. JeanPaul previously was an attorney with Ottinger Abear LLC, where he primarily defended oil and gas clients legally, legacy suits under Act 312 and other business matters. JeanPaul supports his community by serving as a member of the civic leadership roles in Lafayette. In 2013, was honored as one of the top 20 under 40. He serves on the board of the Greater Lafayette Chamber of Commerce for the 2011-2013 term, where he was named to the Executive Committee and CEO Selection Committee. JeanPaul is a graduate of Leadership Lafayette Class 21 and a former board member of the Leadership Institute of Acadiana, where he assisted with corporate restructuring. JeanPaul was served as 5 years of the Cajun Dome Commission and governing body of the Cajun Dome Convention Center, located in the heart of District 45. He also involved in the 705 Young Professionals, Acadiana Home Builders Association, Realtor Association, and Acadiana Boy Scouts of America, Evangelical Council, Leukemia Lymphoma Society, which named him 2008 Man of the Year, Faith House of Acadiana Lafayette, Young Lawyers Association, and the Crew of Gabriel. JeanPaul, a conservative family, has deep roots in Lafayette. His grandfather, now deceased, was Dr. G. Louis Coussan, a professor and former dean of the College of Education at UL Lafayette. JeanPaul's dad, now deceased, was Dr. George Coussan, a prominent radiologist and a former quarterback of the Raging Cajun, leading them to the 1970 Grantland Rice Bowl. JeanPaul's grandmother is Mrs. Mary E. Coussan, a retired school teacher in the Lafayette Parish school system. JeanPaul is a mom, Mrs. Joella Becknell Coussan, an established realtor with the Van Eaton in Maryland. JeanPaul attended primary Primary Elementary, Our Lady of Fatima, and the St. Thomas More High School. He received both his undergraduate and his church doctorate from LSU. Jean Paul has his wife of 6 years, Jennifer Roy, have 3 children, George, Claire, and Caroline. They are parishioners of Our Lady of Fatima Catholic Church here in Lafayette. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Carol. Appreciate it. I'm not sure what else I have to say about myself. It pretty much covers my resume. One update, because I started this process a few years ago. I've been married to my wife now for 8 years. So that's a big difference. You know, 6 to 8, they say once you get past 7, it looks really good for you for the long term. So I'm at 8 years and 3 kids. My youngest is 18 months, my oldest is 6 years. So I've got a long-term perspective on what my kids are doing now and what they're going to be looking at as we all are in Lafayette for the next 15 to 25 years. That's one of the main reasons that I jumped into this race. I saw a leadership vacuum that has jumped from the generation who is in leadership positions now to my generation. And there's nobody in between. I'm 37 years old this month. You can look at who our leaders are now from the congressional level all the way down to our city parish government. And most of those folks are all around the same age. And then there's a big gap in between. And in my leadership roles in the community, in our office, in the different nonprofit organizations that I've been a part of, as part of the Cage Dome Commission, I realized that there was a great opportunity to be a leader in this community and have an impact beyond my own home. But at my house, that's the #1 place where I need to be a leader. So with all of this, you know, the first person that I made sure that was on board with me was my wife. And I still have to convince her, you know, every day I feel like I need to make an effort to make sure that she knows that they're #1, that my faith is #2, well, excuse me, my faith is #1, my wife is #2, and this race is probably a distant third. And I'm going to wake up the same person after this race that I was the day before I went to bed. So I look forward to, you know, all of the parts of this race, and we can talk about that here in a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit more about my background, who I am, how I got to be where I am, and you know, where I would like to be as part of this community. As Carol mentioned, I was very close. Actually, we mentioned the biography, but I was very close with all 4 of my grandparents. Only one of my grandparents is still alive, Mary B. Fleming Coussan, and actually met one of her friends growing up from Alexandria the other day on the trail, and I had a great conversation. It was the father, you know, your dad. What's his full name?
Flynn.
Sidney Flynn. So Sidney Flynn, I knocked on his door, and he said, Jean-Paul Coussan. He said, "Are you related to Mary B. Coussan?" I said, "Yes, sir. That's my grandmother." And I thought he was going to go into basically my grandfather's experience at UL. He said, "No, your grandmother's maiden name was Mary B. Fleming. Her 4 brothers' names were A, B, C, and D. They all 4 had nicknames. Here's their nicknames. Here's the branches of the military that they served. Here's what happened to them after the military service. Here was the history of your great-grandfather, who was a Fleming, who was a police officer in Alexandria and died in the line of duty." So that's just walking one door one morning and learning that much about myself. And so that's another great you know, thing that I've been learning, walking door to door, is it's not just learning about everybody in the community. I'm still learning about who I am and where I come from. So that was my grandmother, who's still living. My grandfather on my mom's side was Harry Becknell. He was a lifelong resident of New Orleans. He's from Destrehan, grew up on Mississippi River, but raised my mom in Kenner and then on Carrollton Avenue in New Orleans. So my mom was a city girl, and my grandfather, he liked the country. And he moved his family out to Kenner at one point, which was a little bit further out in the country at that time than Carrollton Avenue and Canal and everything. And he decided to run for alderman in Kenner. And he was a Becknell, which is kind of a Scotch-Irish English name. And of course, he drew an Italian. Okay, so that's who he ran against, was an Italian in Kenner. And to this To the day he died, he thought that my grandmother voted against him so that they would have to move back to New Orleans because he lost. And the next thing they knew, they were back in New Orleans living on Carrollton Avenue, which is where my mom was raised. I spent many, many summers living with them in New Orleans. I really cherish the memory of my grandparents from New Orleans. Hold a special place in my heart, particularly because my grandfather invested in real estate. He retired from Shell after World War II. He served in World War II, received a Silver Star, Bronze Star for gallantry, and you could probably correct me on the names, but he had a Silver Star and a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. And that's a whole nother story, but he got shot twice in Europe, once in France, and then once after they crossed the line into Germany. The first time he got shot in the leg, they sent him back to England, and he healed up, and he was at an officer's party, and he got caught dancing with his commanding officer's date. And he said, "Captain Becknell, looks like your leg's working pretty well, sir. Back to the front line." So it wasn't long before he took shrapnel on his knee, and that was the end of it. That was right after the Battle of the Bulge. He missed the Bulge, and then he marched into Germany, and he was there for the once the war ended. So my grandfather was a real estate investor. After he retired from Shell, he got into draftsmanship, taught draftsmanship at Delgado Community College, and then he got into contracting and acquired rental properties. When I was a young kid and into high school, because he owned it until 2005. He owned most of his rental properties until 2005, and I know the reason. I know that date for a reason. But I used to go around with him collecting rent from all of the tenants, and they were from all socioeconomic backgrounds. And I learned a lot about the tenants, and I learned a lot about the diplomacy that he had to show in order to collect rent on a monthly basis and make sure my grandmother was happy with what the money, because he didn't ever collect all of it, but she needed enough to go, buy her Chisaisi ham from Lakeview Fine Foods. So they always got what they needed. But my grandfather took care of our family, and I learned from him the art of the real estate world, of rentals, and of dealing with tenants. In 2005, he divested all of his interest in his real estate in August of 2005. Does everybody remember what happened in August of 2005? 1 week after he divested himself of all of these mid-city rentals, Hurricane Katrina came in and wiped every one of them out. After 30 years of owning all these properties, he got out the week before all of them, and he didn't have insurance on any of them because there was no loans, and he bought them for pennies on the dollar. He bought them in the late 70s, so no insurance on any of them, but he got all of his money out of it the week before. Unfortunately, he had sold it to my cousin, so who did have insurance, but Katrina was over Florida when they secured the policy, and so he actually was able to collect on most of his policies. So that was just an interesting family story. My first cousin, Pete Becknell, is rolling out a film, actually, which you probably appreciate, that just went on Facebook last night. They did the trailer about my cousin and my cousin's experience through Katrina as he was living in the rentals when it hit. And my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, flies helicopters for the military, National Guard. And he was able to fly in personally with the coordinates of one of these rentals where my cousin and his entire family was, and half the neighborhood. One gentleman, an African-American with no legs, had made it to the top of their building, and they all got rescued. My brother-in-law flew them and set them all up on the helicopter, and finally the man came down on a basket, and he said, "Where is Peter Becknell?" This is my first cousin. "Where is Peter Becknell?" They said, "Well, that's Peter Becknell over there." They said, "Well, tell him to get in the helicopter. His cousin said to get inside." So he was sending everybody else. My cousin was sending everybody else except himself. He didn't realize it was his first cousin's husband flying the helicopter. So that's my Katrina story. But it really, I just wanted to expand upon the family that I have, the stories that we have, the richness of the lives that we've lived, and how we've come closer to one another. My grandfather in Lafayette was Gaston Louis Coussan. He went by Dr. G. Louis Coussan. He was the Dean of the College of Education at UL, and in the late 70s, but he taught there from the 50s through the early 80s, so he was there for over 30 years. He was a disciplinarian to his family, to my father, to me, and he had a very high standard on educational excellence. And that's the type of environment that I was raised under from my grandparents through my parents. I've always tried to be an overachiever in school, in athletics. I took to athletics early on. I learned discipline through athletics. I learned teamwork, and I learned competitive edge. And I really give that to my father. My dad was, as he mentioned, Dr. Coussan, George Coussan, and he became a physician after attending Lafayette High and was the football quarterback for the best team that Lafayette High ever had to this day. They lost to Terry Bradshaw in the state semifinals, and that team, you know, well, why are you mentioning that? That team is probably the closest group of men that Lafayette High has ever had, because they still meet every year to talk about that team. Coach Rayford LeBlanc, who lives right across Johnson Street back in the neighborhood, still calls me and we visit and we go to Hub City Diner. And he tells me the stories about that team, how they developed, how he got the coaching staff together, and why to this day it's the best team that he ever coached. After that, my dad went on to UL and played under Coach Falkenberry, who became friends with me. Coach Falkenberry took their team in 1970 to the Grantland Rice Bowl. The Grantland Rice Bowls, they had been to a couple of bowl games, but this was the best team they ever had as a record was concerned. And once again, that team has met consistently over the years. There's judges, doctors, physicians, lawyers, physicians, engineers across the state that come together. And once again, it taught me camaraderie. You know, what does it mean to be a team? What does it mean to develop relationships with people that are lasting? Growing up personally, I lived off of Ambassador Caffrey. Where I grew up was on West Governor Miro. Anybody know where that is? And that neighborhood was developed as Villa Hernandez is the name of it. One of the up-and-coming developments on the western side of the city back in the late 70s, early 80s when my parents moved home from New Orleans. And where we grew up was behind us was a field. In that field now is a Walmart. In that field is now Remax real estate company. But when I was there, we leased the field for horses, and we had a beekeeper who would lease it and keep bees right behind the house. And we had, rabbits. I mean, it was really the country, the furthest west that the city went at that point. We watched Ambassador Caffrey grow. We watched it grow into 4 lanes. And while it was growing into 4 lanes, my mom would send me out to Ambassador Caffrey to give away free rabbits, because they did breed like rabbits. And we gave them away, and there was the place that we would send, the lady who picked all of the rabbits up, I'll never forget, her dad owned the Red Feed Barn on Johnson Street. Anybody know where that was? That's where we'd have to go pick up our feed for the horses. It was a clothing store, now it's shut down. I think it's a furniture store or a car store right up the street up here. The ladies who, her dad owned that store, she picked up all the rabbits from me and just said, go back to your house. You're on a major throughway. But back then, 1986 or so, Lafayette was a small town. We've grown to so much bigger now. And we're on the cusp of significant growth. And there's actually demographers who are saying that we're going to add 50 to 90,000 people to Lafayette in the next 20 years. So the question is, what do you want your city to look like? What do you want the government to look like? I have a vested interest in making sure that the city that we live in, the university that is down the street, is an appropriate place for me to raise my children. For a place where my children can find a job when they want to get a job. For a place that my children can raise their kids when it's time for them to raise kids. And that's the situation that I'm in right now. I know you've heard from my other opponents, both very good people. Jan's daughter actually used to babysit for me. Her name is Taylor Swift. My kids would get excited, but it wasn't the same Taylor Swift when she showed up. And Andre was a professional acquaintance of mine that I met through the Chamber of Commerce. But the one thing I can distinguish myself from them is that I've got a lot on the line. I've got a lot to risk. I've got a growing business. I've got a growing family. And that I'm not putting that all on the line just for this race. But all of that is at risk depending upon the type of city that we have, the governance that we have, the politicians that we have, and the decisions that we're making for our infrastructure, for our higher education, for our K-12 education, for our budget. And if we don't provide for the type of environment where businesses can grow. And businesses are going to go elsewhere. People are going to go elsewhere. In today's economy and in this world, people are very mobile. People can work out of their houses from wherever they want, and we're seeing a lot of that right now. We want to make sure that we put in place an economy here where people can stay if they want to stay. We're going to go through some tough times here, of course, times of uncertainty with the low oil prices. Fortunately, we still do have some service opportunities for oil, for natural gas. Not only in Louisiana, but in all the places. But we have so many people who are dependent upon oil and gas. I sense that we are going to feel it here locally. But we're more diversified than we used to be. So I think that we're going to be able to withstand whatever low point that we have over the next couple of years. And as far as the state government is concerned, I think it's going to be a tough time in state government. Over the last 10 years, our state government budget has grown from around $14 billion to $25 billion. And yet still we have a $1.6 billion shortfall this past year. That doesn't make sense if you're a budget type person. How do we have such an imbalance in our budget? My answer is that it's my #1 priority. You asked me earlier, what's the first 2 things that I'm going to try to accomplish? Well, the first 2 things in talking to the legislators, not only in the Acadiana delegation, but guys around the state and ladies from around the state, is that we're going to tackle the big budget issue. My proposal will be to have a constitutional convention, open the door to all of those things. Right now we can't cut what we need to cut and we can't fund what we need to fund. So we need to find those areas of statutory limitations and constitutional limitations where we can cut government where we need to cut government, and that way we can fund the things that need to be funded, possibly those things that aren't funded consistently enough. In particular, once we get past the budget and shore up the budget, then we're going to talk about how do we fund higher education properly. And part of funding higher education is not just throwing money that way, right? It's not just throwing money towards education. For higher education in particular, we're going to talk about autonomy. How do we give these guys more autonomy in order to succeed in a competitive educational marketplace? And if we're giving the autonomy to some of these universities, like UL, like LSU, top tier state universities, and the 2 highest populations of students in the state, those guys that are successful at attracting students will be the ones who are successful in maintaining a balanced budget. Right now, the way the state budget works is, Natalie Harder from South Louisiana Community College said that for every dollar she gets from the state, she has to send back almost half of that to cover bureaucratic charges that the state sends down. Things that don't have to be there, like maintaining making the universities and SLCC use a state auditor rather than having an auditor in-house. It would be much more affordable. Things like contract procurement. Who do we order our pens from? Who do we order our travel from? All of these things have to go through the state, and it costs more, and it takes too much time. But when we talk about autonomy, we're not just talking about tuition autonomy. That's what everybody kind of thinks is the main thing, tuition autonomy. Now, tuition autonomy is important because you're going to have a proper balance on supply and demand. If you price it right, you're going to have the right supply. If you price it too high, then the demand's going to go down, and you're not going to have the right students. So the good colleges will be able to charge whatever they want on an ongoing basis to make sure that they can get the students in to sustain the revenue for their schools. But more importantly to me is on the operational side, making sure that schools have the autonomy to negotiate their own contracts. On the K through 12 side, it's one of the fascinating things about walking door to door. It doesn't matter how conservative somebody is when they answer a door or how liberal they are, because I can see if someone's a Republican or a Democrat. I never know where they're coming from when we start talking about K through 12, because it's such an important issue and so close to everyone's hearts, from the parents to the students and the teachers. All have a vested interest in our K through 12 educational system, and then everyone else, because if you look at the electorate and how many of the electorate, what percentage of the electorate has children in our public school system, that number actually might surprise you. It's not as big as you would think, right? Because many people's children have grown up, so they're no longer in the system. But we still all have jobs, we still all have companies, and we still have colleagues, staff members, and that are all subject to this educational system that we have a vested interest to make sure thrives. So the first thing I would do on any K through 12 issue is talk to the parents. I want to make sure that the educational marketplace starts at home. From there, then we talk to the teachers and we find out whether or not the system that's in place has been trained properly for them, and they're able to carry it into the classroom on a consistent basis. And so, you know, I think Bobby Jindal probably made a big mistake several years ago when Common Core came into play because it was not discussed. It was not brought to the people. The people didn't have a say in it. The parents were surprised by it. The teachers were thrown into another system that they had to be retrained that they weren't aware of. And then 3 years later, we're talking about disregarding Common Core and trying to get it in a new system. And the one thing for our kids is that these kids, they're not aware of all of these high-level discussions. All they know is that they might have to change the way that they're learning 1 year to the next, and then 3 years later try to learn a different system. That concerns me. I want to make sure that there's consistency and there's consistent open discussion about the type of education that our students are being subjected to. And of course, I've got my concerns about Common Core, and I assume that I'll probably get a question from somebody about it. But I'm concerned about the privacy issue. I'm concerned about federal overreach. Very skeptical of the federal government's involvement in our local education system. And I think that's why it's very important that all of you maintain a fantastic relationship with all of our school board members. Because at the end of the day, when I'm telling you that the federal government should not be involved, our local school boards should be involved, and that's the ones that we should be dealing with directly. So I was happy to see that you brought some of the school board members in here over the last couple of years. Not sure, other than that, I could talk about infrastructure. Infrastructure is a big part of not only my platform, but is an interest of mine. Our infrastructure system, I've talked to every gubernatorial, the top 3 gubernatorial candidates. I've sat down and I said, look, if you become the next governor, I want you to remember one thing about the conversation with me, is that I'd like you to turn DOTD upside down. DOTD is broken. We have $1 billion backlog on roads and bridges in this state, and there is no amount of taxation that's going to fix it. And we're not here to talk about taxes. We're here to talk about the broken system that you have. And that has to do with the contract procurement. It has to do with the project delivery methods that they're using. It has to do with the bonding process. And it has to do with the governor and the priorities that he sets when he gets into office. And as you all know, the governor is very strong here in Louisiana. And so, we need to make sure that DOTD is the major focus of our next governor, so that with the money that we have coming in right now, that number one, the money is not raided by other funds, and that the money is used efficiently and in a manner that gets bricks and mortar and concrete on the ground and asphalt on the ground quicker than it is right now. So with that, I'd like to open up questions and hopefully answer them for you to your satisfaction. Okay.
Thank you again for coming. Appreciate it. I've got a few questions. I'm going to start off with what one business experience, government experience, or life experience makes you uniquely qualified to be the next representative District 45?
Sure. Business, life.
Take your choice.
Well, let me tell you what's made me unique as a person. I covered all of my family. I probably went into more detail than some of you care about, but I really love my family. When I was 14 years old, my dad died, and it changed me. made me grow up really fast. I was 14 and I had to deal with adults in adult situations and insurance and, you know, and taxation. You know, that was right when, that was in 1993. Bill and Hillary had just come into office. They had not taken back the estate tax at that time. I think it came in, if my years are off, you know, the Republican Revolution, I think they kind of did away with the death tax at some point in there. But we were hit by the death tax pretty hard. And, you know, so, you know, this notion that, you know, we grew up in a household of a physician was a lot different after the physician died. And so, you know, after that, you know, I was the man of the household. And it wasn't just, you know, going to football practice and, you know, having fun with the friends. It was dealing with adults and taking phone calls about, you know, what had happened, and you know, that changed me immediately. At that point, we had a farm out in Sunset. We had 30 head of cattle, 13 horses, and, you know, by the time I got my license when I was 15, I was pulling trailers, hauling sawdust, and that was in Sunset, not in our backyard in Lafayette anymore. So I started taking care of the property to a large extent in Sunset at 15. I spent many weekends out there. At 16, I was probably staying out there, you know, without adult supervision as a necessity. You know, taking care of things on the weekends, veterinarian services, and also taking care of, you know, the incoming cash flow from the sale of the animals, and dealing with the horses and everything that we had to deal with. So for, I would say, you know, 10 years from the time I was 14 to the time I was 20, in my early 20s, I had this, you know, this cloud of my dad's death over my head, and he was an overachiever, you know, and I just really had a high standard, but really no one left to hold me to that standard. So I was the one that held myself to that standard, and of course my mom was very supportive of me, and to this day she is. So I would say, you know, that's the number one issue that changed me as a person. It made me, you know, people will say I'm the young candidate, and I'll tell you all here that I'm older than Drew Brees. I don't know if you like Drew. He probably belongs in the Hall of Fame, and I'm older than him. But that changed me more as a man, and it made me who I am today for my family and my business and the politics that I'm engaging in.
Thank you. What percentage of District 45 do you believe falls below the poverty level or at the poverty level? And what promise can you make to those that occupy that lower socioeconomic strata that you will effectively represent them?
I think the number of children that are below the poverty line in District 45 is about 20%. And many of those children attend Prairie Elementary, which is the elementary school that I attended, kindergarten through 3rd grade. Which is a fantastic school with fantastic teachers, and they embark in the Leadership in Me program. There's a couple of things about how to impact, you know, that part of the demographic. Number one, let's talk about real estate. We have a homestead exemption in Louisiana. It exempts you for the first $75,000 of value for your owner-occupied home. So if you own a house that's valued at less than $75,000, then you're not paying any property taxes. I think that's something that is that should be maintained at that level. If you put it any higher, then you're going to start putting the weight of the tax burden on our businesses, and I want to avoid that. If you make it any lower, then that's going to be a tax increase on those that desperately need their monthly income to take care of their family. So I want to maintain our homestead exemption. From the economic standpoint, I want to look at our entire economy. If we don't have an economy and a business climate in Louisiana that can support employees and staff people of all different industries, then we're not going to have jobs. So to answer your question, it comes down to jobs. Right now we've got a situation where we've got this last session with a $1.6 billion shortfall where they had to balance the budget. And they started looking at balancing the budget on the backs of businesses. Now, what happens when you increase taxes on businesses? They can't hire as many people. Particularly, locally, we have an inventory, across the state, we have an inventory tax. And that inventory tax is offset by credit. And that credit has now been reduced. So what happens when the credit is reduced? Well, it actually increases the taxes on those businesses. Well, those businesses are just going to move their inventory somewhere else. Now we don't need someone manning the warehouse. You don't have somebody that needs to go do the monthly audit of their supplies. And I just think that that's a very specific example of the types of jobs that people are going to get if we continue to raise taxes on our business. So we have to make sure the business climate is thriving, and that way it'll lift all people up.
Thank you. The city parish government states that many of the roads in Lafayette Parish are state roads. And of course, we all know the potholes need to be repaired and the roads need to be widened, expanded. What is your plan, or what is your platform to improve and expand state roads in Lafayette Parish should you be elected District 45 representative?
Sure. I have a very specific plan, and it actually has been written into a white paper. Cambo Vasagi was the former Secretary of DOTD, and he has identified something that is a fact. There has been no highway plan in place in the state of Louisiana since, I believe it was the Foster administration who put it in place. Since then, it's only been updated, amended, and extended. It's time to get back to a real plan that's not going to continue to put us in a continual budget shortfall. I mentioned it in my talk earlier. CAM's plan has a lot to do with the project delivery methods. I have a copy of this white paper that he wrote, and he's an engineer, and I'd probably be speaking out of turn to try to rehash exactly the plan, but I'm going to tell you how I think about it. It's a project delivery method issue. We've got to do more with less. And when you have an identifiable plan with road by road that doesn't change every year with the whim of the executive that you stick to, then you could actually see the results. Specifically in Lafayette, as you know, Lafayette is a giver parish. We give a lot more money to the state coffers than we receive back. Specifically, you can see it in our highways. Besides the actual project delivery method change, it does take high-level communication and relationship building at the state level to bring make some of those decisions and have people vote against their interests from around the state to say that, all right, we're going to fund this project here in Lafayette versus the one up in North Louisiana or on the Florida, the Florida parishes. So I'm going to make it my priority to build coalitions that are willing to put Lafayette as a priority, specifically on roads and bridges. And then once the priority is made, then we'll have the funding mechanism in place through the project delivery method changes that I intend on following through on.
Thank you. Thus far in the campaign, have you made any no tax pledges to date?
The pledges that I've made are to my wife and to God and to the country. I haven't made any pledges. I don't intend on making any pledges. A couple things that I didn't mention, which are on my push card, but the culture that we talk about is very important to me. I'm somebody that really immerses myself and our family into the culture that we have here in Lafayette. And it's not all just the food and the revelry, but it's the people. I walking door to door, talking to people is part of our culture, and learning our history and maintaining the roots that each one of us have here. And that's what I want to build upon, not only the culture that we have, the roots that we have, but making sure that 25 years hence, we've got a similar culture, regardless of who's here and what leaders that we have. And how do we do that? I think it's a fine line with so many new people moving in town. But it's going to take those of us who are here now maintaining that independence and not succumbing to what the national fads are on development and infrastructure. So, you know, you talked about development and infrastructure. I think that does cut away some of our culture, some of the free market principles that we have, what people want to do with their property, what they want to do with their families. You know, over-regulation is going to be something that I'll fight against because I think it takes away some of the human spirit that we have, the culture that we have. So just for what it's worth, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Go ahead. You standing up, okay? Anyhow, Ray, would you please come up and we'll have Mr. Ed right after that.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come speak with us. First question is, I do not notice anywhere on your little bill here, are you Democrat or Republican?
A Republican.
How come you didn't mention it? You're not proud of it?
I introduced him.
Yeah. I think it's on most of my other materials, but I am proud of it.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Well, just minor little question, but I couldn't help.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, with the Don Trump of Lafayette, I ask what I feel. Oh, well, you want me to stand up and read this now?
No, I don't want you to read it.
Okay.
I just want you to know I read
Next
it.
question, you talk about a constitutional convention. What exactly, specifically, would you like to improve? I don't mean just change now. We got change with Obama. We don't want change. We want improvement. So what specifically are you talking about?
Right.
And then the third question, I'm concerned about the Constitution, civics, and government. I'm a firm believer in improvement. I found very strongly in we the people power, the strongest power we have in this country. Remember, we can put you in, we can take you out. So I'm concerned, we are already making plans to put a bill in Congress requiring that all political and appointed candidates have to pass the same 100-point quiz that immigrants have to pass to become citizens. Would you be for that? Yes or no? And if not, why not? Because
Which governing authority? I'm sorry, would you want to have the test?
the United States citizen and immigration test, it's a 100-point quiz. It's the same one that we got the state bill just passed.
Right.
That high school
the high school
students.
students, yeah.
Right.
I'm a supporter of that.
Okay. But for the political candidates, that's what we're concerned about, because the bill is going to be presented, bringing that forward. So those are the questions that I have. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Yeah, just briefly. Thank you for the questions. Yes, I'm a proud Republican. I've been a Republican since I registered to vote. I voted for Bob Dole first. That was my first election for president that I took part in. I volunteered for Bush Cheney back in 2000, before Bush lost some of the favor. But back in 2000, it was one of the it was a great experience for me to be involved with the electoral process. I volunteered here in Lafayette. So I've been involved with the Republican Party. But beyond Republican Party politics, which I follow pretty closely, you know, what defines me as a person is just more, you know, that I'll go to Our Lady of Fatima Church. I graduated from St. Thomas More. I ended up going to LSU and LSU Law School, and then I met my beautiful wife. And really, those are the main things about me that I think about. I don't think about myself as a partisan. It's not something when I discuss with people, when I knock on a door, I can see whether or not someone's Republican or Democrat. And there's almost 50% Democrat voters registered in this district, District 45. So I don't skip the Democrat houses. I tell them that I've got the best ideas as a Republican that are going to help everybody move forward, whether you know, then they can disagree with me, but it's my job to convince them otherwise. But I knock on every door. And so to the extent that it's not on here, you know, I am a proud Republican, and I appreciate you pointing that out. Also don't have on here that it's District 45 that I'm running in, so I'll put a map here in the front and to show you exactly where the boundaries are. It goes from Fieldspan on the west to University on the east, and on this side of the Vermilion River. So this restaurant is geographically the center of the district. So just to give you an idea, Johnson Street, Congress, Erath, Landry, Dulles, and everywhere in between. I'm in favor of the bill that Stuart Bishop had passed this past session, and actually I'd like to see the tests that the students are having to take. I think, yeah, I'd love to see that. And you know, so with the 100-point questions, I think that that'd be whether it has to be passed into law. You know, I'm not sure if it has to be a law. I mean, we talk about, but I'd be willing to voluntarily take the test and make sure that you would know who doesn't volunteer to take the test, right? And if somebody doesn't volunteer to take the test, I think you can judge, you know, how you think about that candidate.
Would you be for a bill, though, mandated?
What's a state? You talking about a state legislative bill
yes.
mandating that a politician take a 100-point test? I think that'd be a fantastic bill. You know, that would keep everybody at the highest level. You know,
would you vote for it? Yes.
I would vote for it. I might file it for you.
Pardon?
I might file it for you. But I'm going to talk to Stuart Bishop first, and we'll find out what kind of flack he got. You know, but I know he got his bill passed, so I'm happy to hear that.
Wait, you just admitted you have to ask somebody else before you make a decision.
No, I want to know how his bill got passed. I want to know how it got passed through the House. So I'm anxious to see the bill, how he filed the bill and how it got passed, what committees it got passed by.
We made about 8 trips to Baton Rouge.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So if we can make one trip and get it done quickly, I want to know how we got it done. You know?
What about the Constitutional Convention? What specifically?
Okay, good point. So since 1974, we've had special interest after special interest go in and get their particular funds protected, whether through a constitutional amendment or through legislative action. And there are hundreds of these funds that are protected. So the question is, who has the political will to open that door and talk to all these different special interests? And these guys from, you know, all these other parts of the parish are going to say, well, don't come and talk to, you know, my small special interest, the neighborhood group who might have some fund that's protected, or, you know, or something over here that might be protected. But I think there has to be the political will to look at everything, because we don't have, the budget that we have in place right now is insufficient to fund higher education. It's insufficient to fund the infrastructure needs that we have. And we're not planning on raising any revenue either. The point being, we need to figure out the wasteful spending that's going on that's not beneficial to the state. So it's a political will on a large issue, not any one deal. It's opening up the box of the protected funds and basically looking at what areas of government should not be protected by Constitution or by statute. You know, constitutions are supposed to be structural, you know, and protecting us from our government, right? That's not how Louisiana's Constitution works. It very much reads like legislation. And I don't think that's right. I think it should be more of a structural constitution, a separation of powers, and protecting us from what the government can do, instead of the legislative type bills that are constantly put up as constitutional amendments.
Ed, would you come up, please?
I'm glad you brought up education and protected laws in our Constitution. It's right on what I was going to ask you. I was a teacher for 31 years, and a few months back, Representative Robideau came in and kind of described that process to us. Being as stupid as I am in state politics, I had no idea. But I'm kind of wondering, education is not protected, and healthcare is not protected. And each year, we see more and more cuts to education. This year, I think about 6 or 8 months ago, the chancellor of LSU threatened to to put, yeah, to put bankruptcy upon LSU if the governor did any more cuts. And I don't know if that was just a political threat, but it sounds pretty scary to a teacher, you know. So I'm just wondering if you just told us that you see an imbalance there, which I think is great. But how would you go about getting education protected or getting health care protected, and then undoing some of the other funds that could possibly be rated at the end of the year if they haven't spent all their funds to balance the state budget?
So I would answer that going back to what I mentioned earlier. It has to do with autonomy. It's not just protecting healthcare or protecting higher ed. It's that those are the only two things left to cut right now, right? So we can't cut where we need to cut to fund what we need to fund. So I'm not advocating going in and protecting necessarily, you know, by constitutional amendment or legislation any particular one class. I want to make sure that everybody is open to the necessities of budgeting. And right now that's not the case. But it has more to do right now. This is Dr. Alexander and Dr. Savoie. You know, they're proponents of more autonomy. There's a national trend. There's a national trend of higher education of decreasing state funding. I mean, just across the country. And there's other states that are ahead of Louisiana, ahead by way of they fund even less for state universities. But we're on the same trajectory. So we have to look at this as a educational marketplace with autonomy, allowing people to have tuition autonomy to an extent and operational autonomy. And that's going to give the universities the ability to budget year in and year out on their own without having to worry so much about state funding. So it's not about protecting the funding, it's about allowing the university to protect its own revenues and expenses based upon the income that they're getting from their student tuition. And that's basically how you're going to be able to attract, in my opinion, more professors from around the country, because professors don't like to look at a university that has so much uncertainty, you know, which in the last couple of years, Louisiana certainly faced that. And we're going to face it again this year probably with mid-year budget cuts. But so it comes back down to autonomy again. It's not about protecting somebody by the Constitution like we have now. We want everything to be open.
Jim Reeves, you have a question, I believe, right?
Thank you for coming out tonight. I enjoyed your talk. My question has to do with the state contracts that are let out to consulting firms and others, primarily, as I understand it, out-of-state firms. I don't know the details, but I think Mr. Kennedy wrote a column in the paper some time ago. And I don't recall how many millions, but I was surprised at how big the total contracts that the state lets out. And some of the titles and some of the subjects seem awfully Mickey Mouse. And some of it seems like it's to these agencies who are pretty high-priced people. Looks like they could do some of this work in-house. They're well-paid people. They don't need to be hiring people from some foreign state to come in to advise them on consulting something that they ought to know. And I wish you would comment on what is the total amount of money, and what do you think about all these contracts?
I think they're absurd. Governor Jindal recently hired a consultant out of state to come in and talk about what would be cut from the budget. I think he paid them $5 million to do that. But don't we have a legislative auditor on staff? I'm sure, you know, many of us, if we sat down, we have a streamlined commission that recently came up with a plan a few years ago. There's been no less than 5 different commissions or boards that have looked at our budgetary process over the last several years, none of which have been fully implemented. These contracts need to be open. I think the legislature did not pass a bill this past session that would have had a threshold for a threshold for the dollar value of a contract that would actually have to be legislatively approved. I think they need to revisit that so that there's some transparency and accountability. And look, it hits not close to my home, but close to Lafayette. There are in-state entities that receive contract, awarded to them that should be open to the public. So the out-of-state ones are even worse, but there's in-state ones that need to be looked at. So we certainly have a problem with these contracts that the executive department and other departments can get into that don't go through the legislative process. And I think that falls under the category of wasteful spending. And we need to make sure that we've got some accountability, and whoever's in this seat, whoever's in any of the seats where any of you live, should be held accountable. So I look forward to finding out more about all the contracts, and I'll look up Kennedy's article that you mentioned. I know he's been one of the guys that's been a big proponent of it in Baton Rouge. So I look forward to working with him as well.
We appreciate this evening, and I want to thank you for again. You're welcome to come in anytime that you can. Appreciate it, sir. Thank you very much. Meeting stands adjourned. Thank you very much.